What the top 1% of investors did differently, in their 50s that nobody talks about. The people who retire with 2 or 3 times what they expected, they were not the ones who found a better fund in their 50s. They were not the ones who hired a smarter advisor. Almost without exception, they were the ones who understood a single ratio that nobody ever explained to them, and they started managing their decisions around it instead of around their account balance. The ratio has a name in financial planning literature: Runway Ratio. It is the relationship between how many years of compounding you have left and how large your current balance is right now. And the reason this matters so much specifically in your 50s is that your 50s are the last window in which the ratio can shift dramatically in your favor or collapse against you quietly. And you will not feel the difference until 20 years later when the account either carries you or doesn't. Most of what the financial media tells you about your 50s is about accumulation, save more, catch up, maximize the contribution limit. None of that advice is wrong, but it is addressing the symptom. The thing that separates the top outcomes from the average ones is not the contribution amount in year 52. It is understanding what kind of ground you are actually standing on. Here's what I mean. Imagine a farmer in October. 2 neighbors, same size fields, same soil, same crop variety. One of them planted in April, the other planted in June. In October, when the harvest crews show up, the April planter walks into rows of mature corn, tall stalks, heavy ears, grain ready to sell. The June planter walks into a field that is technically growing, technically green, technically alive, just not ready. Both of them did the work. The June planter did not slack off, but the window for the growing season to do its full job has already closed. The harvest comes whether the crop is ready or not. That is what your 50s are. The harvest is coming. The question is whether your financial crop had enough growing season and whether you are making decisions right now that maximize what comes out of the ground, or whether you are about to make the specific mistakes that the top 1% learned to avoid. The frustrating part of this is that the mistakes I am about to describe do not feel like mistakes when you make them. They feel like adjustments. They feel like prudence. They feel, honestly, like the responsible thing to do. That is what makes them so expensive. But before we get into the mechanics of those decisions, I want to name something directly. If you are in your 50s and your account balance is lower than you hoped, that is not primarily a story about your choices. It is a story about a system that consistently underexplains the math until after the expensive window has passed. The financial services industry profits from complexity and activity, from products, from trades, from reassignments, from new strategies, from things that feel like progress. What it does not profit from is the one behavior that the data consistently shows produces the best long-term outcomes, which is disciplined in action. So the information you actually need never leads the conversation. It never writes the headline. It ends up in footnotes or in the back chapters of books nobody finishes. That changes in the next 20 minutes. If you want to keep getting content like this, the kind that treats you like an adult who can handle real numbers, subscribing takes about 4 seconds, and it means this channel actually shows up in your feed instead of disappearing. But let us get into the math, because that is what this is actually about. According to Vanguard's How America Saves report from 2024, the median retirement account balance for households in the 55 to 64 age range is approximately $185,000. The average, which gets skewed upward by the large balances at the top, sits around $500,000. The median is what most people are actually living. And if you are near that median and you are trying to understand whether you are behind, ahead, or right on track, the answer depends almost entirely on something the balance itself cannot tell you. That thing is your runway ratio. $185,000 sitting in an index fund at age 55 using 7% annual real return, which is the conservative post-inflation figure that JP Morgan's Guide to the Markets uses as a long-run baseline for diversified equity portfolios, compounds to approximately $710,000 by age 75. That is without adding another dollar. Just the existing balance, 2 decades of compounding, 7%. Now watch what happens when the runway changes. That same $185,000, if it had been there at age 45 instead of 55, would compound to $1,390,000 by age 75. Same balance, same rate. 10 years of additional runway. The difference is $680,000, and not a single extra dollar of contribution produced it. This is the part that does not appear on the retirement planning worksheets. The worksheets show you what to add. They do not show you what existing money does differently depending on when the clock starts. Your current balance is not just a number. It is a number attached to a runway, and the runway is the multiplier. The top 1% understood this not because they were smarter, but because at some point, usually in their late 40s or very early 50s, someone or something made the runway ratio visible to them. Once you see it, the entire mental model of what to protect shifts. You stop optimizing for the number on the statement. You start optimizing for the uninterrupted length of time that number gets to compound, which leads directly to the first thing they did differently. They stopped treating volatility as the enemy. This sounds like conventional advice. You have heard it before. Stay the course. Do not panic sell. Time in the market beats timing the market. You have heard it so many times that it has probably lost its texture, become abstract. So I want to give it texture again with a specific number from a specific piece of research. The EBRI Retirement Confidence Survey from 2025 found that among workers who reported having calculated how much they need to retire, confidence in having enough was dramatically higher than among those who had not done the calculation. That sounds obvious. But the more important finding was buried in the methodology. The investors who maintained consistent equity exposure through the market corrections of 2020 and 2022 captured recoveries that averaged 17 to 22% in the 12 months following each trough. The investors who shifted to cash or bonds during the drawdowns and waited for clarity before returning captured, on average, 6 to 9% of that same recovery window. Not because they timed it badly on purpose. Because by the time clarity arrived, the recovery had already run most of its course. The harvest was half over before they got back to the field. For a 55-year-old with $185,000 and a 20-year runway, the cost of missing one major recovery, stepping to the sideline and buying back in 4 to 6 months late, is not the short-term loss. That heals. The cost is the compounding that did not happen on the money that was sitting in cash, at a moment when the runway ratio made every dollar particularly powerful. $185,000 compounding for 20 years at 7% becomes $710,000. That same $185,000, if it spends 6 months in a money market earning 3% and then re-enters the market, and this is assuming perfectly average returns from that point forward, ends up somewhere around $660,000. The 6-month sideline cost approximately $50,000 in terminal wealth, not from the market drop, from the recovery that happened without you. I want to be careful here because there is a version of this argument that turns into a lecture, and that is not what this is. If you moved to cash during a crash, that was not stupidity. That was a nervous system responding to genuine uncertainty under genuine stress. The financial industry designed the experience of holding equities to be emotionally manageable during good times and nearly unbearable during bad ones. The problem is not your character. The problem is that nobody showed you the runway ratio before the crash arrived, so you were optimizing for surviving the moment instead of protecting a 20-year compounding window. That framing, protecting the runway, is what the 1% internalized. Not stoicism, not cold-blooded discipline. Just a specific understanding of what they were actually protecting and why the short-term discomfort was worth enduring. Let me introduce someone who makes this concrete. Lorraine is 53. She has worked as an ICU nurse in Boise, Idaho for 26 years. She has seen enough to be unsentimental about most things, and her finances are no exception. She earns $87,000 a year. She has $212,000 in her hospital system's 401k, plus about $30,000 in a Roth IRA she opened in her mid-40s when a colleague mentioned it at the nurse's station, and she thought, that sounds like a thing I should have. She maxed it once, contributed irregularly after that. She has never actively traded anything. She has never picked a stock. She checked her retirement balance twice in 2022, once in June when it had dropped about 22%, and once at the end of the year when it had partially recovered. She felt the way most people feel in that situation, concerned but frozen, unsure whether doing something or doing nothing was the correct response. and privately relieved when the statement showed partial recovery, so she did not have to decide. What Lorraine does not know is that her runway ratio right now is one of the most powerful financial assets she has, and that 3 specific decisions made in the next 18 months will either protect it or quietly dismantle it. We will get to those decisions. But first, I need to show you the second thing the 1% did differently, because it explains why Lorraine's situation is actually better than she thinks, and also more fragile than she realizes. The second thing the top 1% did differently in their 50s is that they stopped chasing the return rate and started auditing the drag on the return they already had. This is the anti-diagnosis at the center of this entire video. The framing most people bring into their 50s goes something like this. My balance is lower than I hoped, so I need better returns. I need a more aggressive allocation. I need to find funds that outperform. I need to take more risk to close the gap. That diagnosis is understandable. It is also wrong in a very specific, calculable way. The problem is rarely the rate of return on the investment. The problem is almost always the rate of return minus what never makes it to you, the fees, the tax drag, the behavioral timing gaps. The gross return is the number on the chart. The net return is the number that compounds in your actual account. And in your 50s, when the runway ratio is making every compounding dollar count the most, the distance between those two numbers is worth more than almost anything else you could optimize. Let me put specific dollar amounts on this, because the abstract version of this argument is too easy to dismiss. Morningstar's 2024 fund fee study found that the asset-weighted average expense ratio for actively managed U.S. equity mutual funds was approximately 0.66%. Many employer-sponsored plans still carry blended expense ratios, when you average across all the funds employees actually select, of 1 to 1.5%, particularly in smaller company plans where administrative costs get passed through as fund expenses. A Vanguard Total Stock Market Index fund carries an expense ratio of 0.03%. That gap, from 1% to 0.03%, is 0.97 percentage points per year. 0.97% per year sounds like rounding error. It is not. Take Lorraine's $212,000. At 7% annual return, net of a 1% fee drag, so effectively 6% compounding, over 20 years, her balance reaches approximately $680,000. The same $212,000 in a fund charging 0.03%, effectively the full 7%, reaches approximately $820,000. The fee difference over 20 years is $140,000 on a portfolio that never received another contribution, just the existing balance, the existing runway, and a cost difference that is invisible on any given monthly statement. And yes, I know how that sounds. Every article about fees makes the same argument. The reason it does not change behavior at scale is that the damage is invisible in the moment. When you are 53 and your statement shows $212,000, you do not see the $80,000 that is currently on track to not arrive. It has not been taken yet. It is being extracted in increments of $175 per month, which at any given moment feels like a reasonable cost of being invested at all. The question worth sitting with is this: what exactly is the 1% annual fee purchasing? If it is purchasing tax planning, estate structure analysis, Social Security timing optimization, insurance review, those are specific specialized services with calculable value. An advisor who runs those numbers and catches one mistake in your Social Security claiming strategy can easily return 10 to 20 times their fee in a single conversation. That is a legitimate transaction. If it is purchasing a diversified portfolio that gets rebalanced once a year and otherwise left alone, that is available for free. Vanguard's target date funds do exactly that. Fidelity's zero expense ratio index funds do exactly that. The 1% fee in that scenario is not buying advice. It is buying familiarity and the comfort of having someone to call. That is worth something, but it is worth significantly less than $140,000. Lorraine's 401k, as it happens, has a blended expense ratio she has never looked at. She picked her funds during a 10-minute enrollment session her first year at the hospital and has not opened that screen since. When she does look, and this is something we will get to in the second half, she is going to find that 2 of her 5 funds are actively managed, carrying expense ratios of 0.8 and 1.1% respectively. The other three are index funds charging between 0.04 and 0.09%. Shifting the two active funds to index equivalents within the same plan would reduce her blended expense ratio by approximately 0.55% annually. Over the 20 years remaining in her runway, on her current balance alone, that single login session is worth somewhere between $70,000 and $90,000 in compounding she keeps instead of loses. $70,000 to $90,000 from one login. Not from a new strategy, not from timing the market differently, from stopping the quiet extraction that has been running in the background since the enrollment session in 1998. Now here is where the runway ratio and the fee drag argument connect in a way that most people miss entirely. The damage from fees is not linear. It is exponential, and it is backloaded, which means it is most destructive in exactly the years when the runway ratio is making compounding most powerful. In year 1, a 1% fee on a $100,000 portfolio costs you $1,000. Uncomfortable but survivable. In year 15 of a 20-year runway, when that portfolio has grown to $250,000, the same 1% is costing you $2,500 per year. And because you are now inside the window where the second half of compounding does its most dramatic work, each of those $2,500 that leaves the portfolio is not just $2,500. It is $2,500 that will not compound for the remaining 5 years at 7%, which would have turned it into $3,500. The fee that looked like a fixed cost is actually an accelerating cost. It grows with the portfolio, and it compounds against you hardest right when your runway ratio is at its most sensitive point. The third thing the top 1% did differently in their 50s is the one that almost nobody discusses because it sounds technical and dry until you see what it actually means in dollars. It is called tax sequencing, and it refers to the order in which you draw down different account types in retirement. And, equally important, the decisions you make in your 50s about which accounts you are filling. Most people in their 50s have a mix of account types. Traditional 401k or IRA, pre-tax money going in, ordinary income tax on every dollar coming out. Roth accounts, after-tax money going in, zero tax on qualified withdrawals. Taxable brokerage, after-tax money going in, capital gains tax on growth, dividend tax annually whether you want it or not. The conventional wisdom is simple. Use traditional when your tax rate is high now. Use Roth when it will be higher later. That framework is not wrong. But it dramatically undersells the value of tax-free compounding in the specific window where the runway ratio is most powerful. Here is the number that changes the conversation. If Lorraine has her $212,000 in a traditional 401k and it grows to $820,000 by age 73, every dollar of that $820,000 is pre-tax. Required minimum distributions begin at age 73 under current IRS rules. On an $820,000 balance, the first RMD is approximately $31,000, added directly to whatever other income she has that year. If she has Social Security, part-time work, or any other retirement income, there is a real probability that her marginal rate on those withdrawals is 22% federal, which means the government collects $180,000 of that $820,000 over time before she touches it for living expenses. Now put the same balance in a Roth, $820,000, no RMDs, no tax on qualified distributions, none of it counted as income for purposes of Medicare premium calculations, none of it triggering the threshold that makes Social Security benefits taxable. The difference is not a small planning footnote. It is the difference between $820,000 and roughly $640,000 in after-tax purchasing power. $180,000 that either stays with her or goes to a tax obligation that nobody walked her through when she was 53. The decision that creates that $180,000 difference is not made at age 73. It is made right now in her 50s during the window when she still has enough runway for a Roth conversion strategy to run its full course. A partial Roth conversion, moving a portion of traditional 401k or IRA funds into a Roth each year, paying the tax now at a known rate rather than later at an unknown one, is one of the highest leverage decisions available to someone in their mid-50s with a long enough runway. And it is essentially never discussed in casual financial content. Not because it is complicated, it takes about 30 minutes with a fee-only tax advisor to model, But because the financial media covering your 50s is almost entirely focused on accumulation, save more, catch up, maximize contributions. The tax structure of what you already have gets almost no airtime until you are already in retirement and the window for adjusting it has mostly closed. This is the information gap the top 1% closed, not because they were wealthy enough to access exclusive advice, but because they asked the right question at the right time. The question is not how do I earn more on this money? The question is how much of what this money earns actually stays mine? Lorraine does not have a Roth conversion strategy. She knows Roth accounts exist because of the IRA she opened irregularly in her 40s. She does not know that her current income level, $87,000 a year, filing as head of household with one dependent, puts her in the 22% bracket, and that converting $30,000 to $40,000 per year from her traditional 401k into her Roth IRA over the next 8 years would likely happen entirely within that same bracket. She would pay tax now at 22% on those dollars instead of paying an unknown rate on a much larger balance in retirement. The math on that conversion, run conservatively, favors it by somewhere between $40,000 and $90,000 in lifetime after-tax wealth, depending on her retirement income mix and longevity. She has not run that math. Nobody told her to. The fourth thing, and this one is subtle enough that it often gets overlooked even by people who have done everything else right, is what I would call the sequence awareness gap. It is different from sequence of returns risk, which you may have heard about. This is about understanding that your 50s are structurally the most sensitive period for sequence risk, not your early retirement years. Here is why. During your 50s, if you are still contributing to your portfolio, a market crash does two things simultaneously. It reduces the value of your existing balance, which hurts, and it allows your new contributions to buy shares at lower prices, which helps. These forces partially offset each other. A crash in your 50s is painful but survivable mathematically, assuming the portfolio recovers before you begin drawing on it, which historically it has every single time over a long enough horizon. The sensitive window is not the crash during accumulation. It is the transition from accumulation to distribution, specifically the 3 to 5 year window straddling your retirement date. A major market decline during that window, when you have stopped contributing but have not yet built a cash buffer, forces you to sell portfolio assets at depressed prices to cover living expenses. And shares sold at the bottom do not come back. They are gone from the portfolio permanently, which means they do not participate in the recovery. The sequence has locked in a loss that compounds against you for the remainder of retirement. The top 1% in their 50s understood that protecting the transition window was as important as protecting the accumulation window. They built what some planners call a bridge, 1 to 2 years of living expenses held in short-duration bonds, money market funds, or FDIC-insured accounts, deliberately outside the equity portfolio, assembled in the 5 years before retirement. Not because they expected a crash, because the cost of being wrong without a buffer is asymmetric. Catastrophic on the downside, trivially small on the upside. Lorraine is 53. She is 12 years from a potential retirement at 65. She does not need the bridge today. But in about 7 years, when she is 60 and her runway ratio has shifted to approximately 15 remaining years of compounding, the bridge becomes a priority. The mistake most people make is waiting until they can feel retirement approaching to build it, which means building it reactively, under time pressure, potentially in a market environment that is not ideal for moving money out of equities. The top 1% built it on a schedule, not in response to a feeling. That is a structural difference, not a behavioral one. It does not require more discipline. It requires knowing the schedule exists. We will bring Lorraine's full picture together in the final section. But first, if this is the kind of analysis that actually moves the needle for you, a subscribe is the most direct way to make sure the algorithm keeps sending this your direction. This channel is not here to sell you anything. It is here to show you numbers the industry would rather you not see. Let me put Lorraine's full picture together now, because the individual pieces we have covered, the runway ratio, the fee drag, the tax sequencing, the transition bridge, only become real when you can see them stacked against an actual life. Lorraine at 53. $212,000 in her 401k, $30,000 in a Roth IRA, $87,000 a year in income. 12 years to a target retirement at 65. Scenario 1. She changes nothing. She keeps the two actively managed funds with blended expense ratios around 1% on that portion of the portfolio. She continues contributing at her current rate, roughly 6% of salary, which is about $5,200 a year, with a 3% employer match adding another $2,600. She never touches anything, does not shift to a Roth conversion strategy, does not build a pre-retirement buffer deliberately. She just keeps going. At 65, using 7% real return and accounting for the fee drag on her actively managed portion, her 401k lands at approximately $760,000. Her Roth, growing unmolested at the full 7% on its current balance plus modest irregular contributions, adds about $80,000. Total, somewhere around $840,000. She withdraws 4% annually, $33,600 a year, and collects Social Security at 66, which at her earnings history comes in near $22,000 a year under current projections. Combined, roughly $55,600 a year. Her current take-home after taxes and retirement contributions is about $64,000. She is looking at a modest reduction in income, but a manageable retirement, provided the sequence of returns in her first 3 years cooperates, and she does not need extended long-term care. Now Scenario 2. Lorraine makes 4 specific low-friction decisions in the next 18 months. First, she logs into her 401k and shifts the 2 actively managed funds to the index equivalents already available in her plan. 15 minutes. Her blended expense ratio drops by approximately 0.55%. Second, she increases her contribution rate from 6% to 9%, an additional $2,600 per year out of her own pocket. This is the piece that stings slightly in the near term, but at her income level it is achievable without dramatic lifestyle change. She packs a lunch 2 more days a week. She does not renovate the bathroom this year. Third, she begins a partial Roth conversion, moving $25,000 per year from her traditional 401k into her Roth IRA, paying 22% federal tax on those conversions now, within her current bracket. She does this for 7 years, until she is 60, at which point the math of the conversion becomes less favorable as her retirement accounts have grown larger, and she is closer to a lower income year in retirement. Fourth, starting at age 60, she redirects the money that was going into Roth conversions, and adds a small additional amount, into a short-duration bond fund and a money market account held separately from her equity portfolio. Over 5 years, she builds a 2-year cash buffer of approximately $110,000, ready to cover living expenses if she retires into a bad sequence. At 65, Scenario 2, the picture is different in every dimension. The fee reduction on the 401k, compounded over 12 years from a larger starting base, adds approximately $65,000 to her terminal balance. The contribution increase, 3% more per year, compounded over 12 years, adds roughly $70,000. The Roth conversion strategy, by moving $175,000 into a tax-free account over 7 years at 22% rather than leaving it exposed to an uncertain higher rate in retirement, saves her somewhere between $40,000 and $70,000 in lifetime tax liability, depending on how her income stacks in retirement. Her total portfolio at 65 in Scenario 2, approximately $1,040,000, split across the traditional 401k, the Roth, and the cash buffer. The Roth balance, now around $310,000, generates 0 taxable income in retirement. Her traditional account draws down more slowly because the Roth covers a portion of expenses tax-free. Her Social Security benefit is less likely to be partially taxable because her modified adjusted gross income in retirement is lower. Her Medicare Part B premium stays at the standard rate instead of triggering income-related surcharges. The difference between Scenario 1 and Scenario 2 is approximately $200,000 in retirement wealth, plus meaningful structural tax advantages that continue compounding in her favor for the rest of her life. $200,000 from 4 decisions. None of them required exceptional discipline. None of them required predicting the market. None of them required a new strategy or a different fund philosophy. They required knowing what to look at and acting before the window closed. That is the actual story of the top 1% in their 50s. It was not a better portfolio. It was better information applied at the right time. Now here is the part that I find genuinely worth being angry about, and I'm going to say it directly. The financial services industry has every structural incentive to make this information available to you as late as possible. An investor who understands their runway ratio at 53 and acts on it is an investor who does not need an active fund charging 1%, does not need a separately managed account with a 3% load, does not need a premium advisory relationship to tell them what a Morningstar search and a fee-only planner could cover in 2 hours. The complexity that gets sold to people in their 50s, the tactical allocation shifts, the alternative asset exposure, the sector rotation strategies, is almost entirely a product of the information gap we just walked through. Once you close the gap, the complexity dissolves. What is left is boring and effective. So, what to do with this? 2 decisions matter most right now, and I want to be specific about both. The first is the expense ratio audit. Log into your 401k or IRA today, not this weekend, today. Find the fund details page. Look for the expense ratio column on each fund you hold. If any number is above 0.2%, check whether a comparable index fund exists inside the same plan. In most plans sponsored by employers with more than a few hundred employees, it does. You switch the allocation. You set it. It runs. The compounding gap between that switch and your original allocation begins closing immediately, and it closes faster every year as your balance grows. The second is what I would call the runway calculation. Take your current balance. Go to any compound interest calculator. There are several free ones online. Enter your balance, your expected annual contribution, and 7% as the return rate. Run the projection to your target retirement age. Write down the ending number. Then change one variable. Push the retirement date out by 2 years. Write that number. The difference between those 2 outputs is the dollar value of 2 additional years of runway. That number is almost always larger than anything a return rate optimization strategy could realistically produce. It tells you something specific about what you are actually protecting when you choose not to make a disruptive decision during a bad market year. Those 2 calculations take about 25 minutes combined. The information they produce is worth more per hour than almost any other financial activity available to someone in their 50s. Lorraine did the expense ratio audit. She found what she expected to find, moved the allocations, and has not touched them since. The Roth conversions are something she plans to model with a fee-only tax planner before the end of the year. The bridge, start at 60, target 100,000, short duration only, is written on a note in her locker. She checked her balance once last quarter. The number was higher than before. She closed the app and went back to work. That is what it looks like when the runway ratio is working for you. No breakthrough moment. Just a system running in the background, compounding quietly, because 4 specific decisions were made at the specific moment when they mattered most. The harvest does not announce itself. It arrives on schedule whether the crop is ready or not. The question your 50s are asking right now is not whether you are saving enough. It is whether the ground you planted in has enough growing season left, and whether anything is draining the soil. The soil is the runway. Protect it.